Yo, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the stream. We're going to wait for a couple people to get in here and we'll get rolling. All right, looks like we are live. And the feed is not hot garbage this week. Excellent. Drop a message in the Discord real quick. All right, so looking like I've got 6 of y'all beautiful people in here this evening. Good evening, everybody. We are, 6, 7 days from Christmas now? And continuing this Security Plus journey. I have an assistant this evening. Her name is Zoe. She's probably going to sleep here on my lap the entire time. She's here to help out with any questions you may have. That being said, we're going to hop on to it. Yeah, Cyber Odyssey, I'm happy to see the stream is looking good tonight. Got it up on my laptop here right next to my computer just to keep an eye on it. All right, so this evening we are going to cover Security Plus Domain 2, Objectives 2.3 and 2.4. Cybertologist, good evening. All right, so our objectives. 2.3, summarize secure application development, deployment, and automation concepts. And 2.4 is summarize authentication and authorization design concepts. So a couple of objectives that kind of overlap with each other. They are not mutually exclusive, but they're a little different as far as their deployment and the detail that goes into them in some regards, but for the most part, they are exclusive until you start having secure application deployment that requires authentication and authorization design concepts built into it. For Security Plus, you're not going to need to know the ins and outs of how all of it works as far as the nitty gritty of it. It is very high level, but understanding the concepts and just how it all works and what mostly the main terms is going to be the main focus here. So application development, deployment, and automation. Oh, let me jump back here. So last time I streamed, which has been a few weeks, I touched on the software development life cycles. So you have the waterfall methodology, which essentially is a single direction methodology. You do not stop until you are done. You start with building the system requirements, software requirements, preliminary design, detailed design, code and debug, testing, and then operations and maintenance. Your stakeholders, the customer, the team that you're building this application for, they don't get to see it until it is 100% done. So it gives you a good idea of what the budget really needs to be to go from beginning to end, but it doesn't necessarily give you the flexibility to make changes during that design. Sorry, she is trying to eat my earbud that I have dangling here. Trying to keep the puppy under control. Onward and upward. Is the volume too low, or is it, am I breaking up? I had to make a couple adjustments to my setup, so I don't know if I'm too far from the microphone or what may be the case. Volume. All right. That we can fix. Let me know how it is now. And I will keep on rocking and rolling. But so the waterfall methodology is very static in the way that it runs. Any changes, if you have to make changes in the development process, can be very, very expensive because you're essentially having to reset the process if you have to change anything along the way. Where as you get to an agile or a spiral model, you gather your concept of requirements, you gather the concept of operation, the requirements plan, and then you start deploying prototypes and you start giving those to your stakeholders. And from there, you see how they like it. And then you start another development process. And in some of the methodologies, when you get into Kanban and some of the actual specific methodologies for the agile, the can't remember what they call them, the actual the named processes. There's several of them out there, but you start getting into different methods on how you do it. But I mean, for the most part, you start these cycles where it may be a week, it may be a month, it may be 2 months, but you start the development cycle, and then once you get the feedback from your stakeholders, you start over again, and then you do another round. You give them another prototype, and then you keep going until you have a completely operational product. But it doesn't necessarily stop there. You can continue maybe with a smaller team after the bulk of the work is done, where you continue adjusting the requirements, and you keep building this product that gets better and better over time. Or depending on what company it is, it could get worse and worse. But in theory, it should be what your customer wants and what they desire as far as the requirements and the features and everything else. So as you get into it, at the end, you're really just supporting it and then building it further once you get to that operational prototype or that first deployment. But you just continue creating new iterations, new phases, and solving the requirements of your stakeholders. All right. So in application development, there is a ton of text here on the page, but the main things when you're looking at it, you have several environments that your applications operate in. Development is kind of what it sounds like. It's your development environment where you have an environment that is specifically designed for setup and development of your system or application, whether it is a hardware development where you are prepping switches to deploy into production, or it could be building an application. The test environment is essentially maybe a smaller or a similar environment to your production environment, where you're able to test patches, you're able to utilize all of the permissions, file structures. You've got a lot of the similar data that you'd be working with, or at least the size of the data. So you can essentially test and see if your application can hold up to the strain of the usage that you're going to experience in the production environment. Staging is kind of an optional environment. It depends on how widely used the application is, where you essentially will take it out, and when you have an update or you have an upgrade for your environment, you'll go and deploy it in stages. You have, we're going to do Asia today, we're going to do South America tomorrow, we're going to do Australia a week later. And as you're doing that, you deploy to all these different environments. You're able to test it and see, do we have any issues? And you're testing in smaller batches to where if you have any issues, you can fix them and pause the deployment, and you don't have to worry about deploying to 10,000 endpoints, and all of a sudden you've broken the entire network and you have to get a team together to fix everything all at once. And depending on how severe it is, you may physically have to touch those endpoints. So staging, especially in larger organizations, is going to be something that you'll see. In my job, I do see staging environments depending on the application, but not everything. I've got several applications that are only supporting a team of 8 to 10 people, and they don't have a staging environment. They go straight from test into production. The staging environment, though, when we have something like, you have a new instance of ServiceNow, or you have a major application that supports the entire network, that goes into staging. Is deployed in smaller instances. Or like currently what I'm working on right now, I've got a job where I'm developing firewall rules, and in support of divesting a company, I've got to build out these firewall rules, but I can't deploy them en masse to the entire company. I've got to choose regions that I can deploy them to and segregate it out and test it and see, okay, do we have anything breaking because of this? Nope. Okay, we can go on to the next one. And then we sit there, we wait about a week, check the traffic, and then move on from there. So staging, when you get to your major environments, these companies that are spread out across the globe, just have a lot of footprint, that's when it becomes very important. Production, that is your live and working application. You normally don't touch that and modify it on its own. It is normally gone from the staging point. So the application's live. Unless there's something terribly wrong, you won't actually make adjustments to the production environment. It's going to sit stagnant until you have an update for the application that you were deploying from your test or staging environments. And then provisioning and deprovisioning. Essentially, it's either you're applying permissions, you're giving permissions for something to access the systems, or you're removing them. So provisioning is your addition, giving permissions. So you're installing a switch, you're provisioning a switch into the environment, or you're giving access to a user to a particular environment. Or deprovisioning, somebody leaves the company, you got to deprovision their access. So you've got to remove all of their permissions. And objects can be applications, it can be physical hardware, it can be access into a building. So that provisioning and deprovisioning is kind of a catch-all for anything that is given access. So how you control that access to the environments. And secure coding techniques. The main ones that you need to know. Normalization is when you get something like in a web URL, you get this %2f, %65, %74, %63, %2f, %70, %61, and so on and so forth. And that's at the tail end of a URL. Well, somebody may be trying to backtrack into an actual directory. They're trying to brute force their way through, and not necessarily by, you may have filtering in for anything that says etsy/password, but it may not catch that %2f. So normalization would take your ASCII coding, it'll take any of the various ways of coding and put it back to, it'll sort it down into the least common denominator and be able to block that for you. So that is something that, especially when you're doing any CTFs, things like that, you'll see a lot of normalization where you can get around certain controls by utilizing ASCII encoding and things like that to get around any sort of blocks they may have in place. Code reuse. So code reuse is good in some cases if you have solid code that is trusted. It can reduce mistakes because you're not having to rewrite the same code a million times, but and it'll also reduce costs. But in the same vein, if you have a breach on code, look at like Log4j, it can cause massive damage. You have widespread damage from one library that was used across thousands of companies. So reusing code, it is good, but it has to be monitored and controlled. You got to know what's in your application. If you're using a library that refers to other libraries, you need to know what exactly is there. Um, and then code obfuscation and camouflage. If y'all have been watching Simply Cyber, Dr. Gerald Auger has touched on this a few times, where you get a patch that gets pushed out, and the threat actors are able to reverse engineer it pretty quickly because they're going right for whatever the fix was. Because these teams don't have time to actually hide that fix somewhere else in the code, or they don't have a way to have the time to be able to camouflage it and make it look like they didn't do anything to the code, or they don't make it apparent to the attacker. So if an attacker can read your code and they can identify what it's doing, they can find a way to break it. So using obfuscation, whether it is references, whether it is being able to hide what variables are referencing other variables, just making it more difficult to read, can offer security, but it shouldn't be considered necessarily security in and of itself, but it can help. So it's not something that I would put forefront as a security measure. So in application development, you have a couple different types of validation. So you have server-side validation, where the user submits data, submits a request to the web server, and then the web server validates the user and says, yes, we're good, you can have XYZ, and sends it back over. And then if there's any issues, the user can resubmit, so on and so forth. Client-side validation is everything is done on the user side. So essentially you're submitting a form, and then the server is just taking orders. It's not doing anything on its end. It's just responding with whatever data you're requesting. So there's no secure validation there. Client-side validation tends to be fairly weak when it comes down to it. Server-side validation is going to be your more secure, because you have control. As the business, you have control over what is actually getting authorized to be used. Client side, you see a lot of browser exploits and things like that can leak data and leak passwords, proving to be fairly insecure. But the most part, that is essentially server and client side validation. Sorry, you are being crazy. Why are you being a nut? You're chewing on my hand, you're chewing on my microphone, my headset. All right. So now you're tangled in my headphones. All right. So additional controls, memory management, being able to identify what segments of memory an application can actually use, and limiting where that memory is accessible otherwise, can be effective in preventing your data leakage from memory. Essentially being able to identify data being transmitted across memory, or resting in memory while awaiting a query. Third-party libraries and SDKs, that's Log4j. That's your risk there. Just having controls around that, knowing what is in the software you're developing and deploying. And data exposure, anything that you are retaining on your end as the administrator, as the security personnel for that company, any data that you have on your server, it should not be able to be easily exposed. You shouldn't be able to put in a SQL query of 1 = 1 and get the entire database dumped out. So you want to make sure that you minimize that data exposure, that there are controls in place for certain users can only access certain types of data. That data is obfuscated, or it's been anonymized, that there's ways to protect that data from being leaked and being able to be tied back to individuals or being used elsewhere. And then just additional terms that you need to know. Compilers, essentially move your high-level code, so your languages like Python, Ruby, and they actually translate it into machine code. And then you have your other ones, your non-compiled code. You have stuff like Shell, your bash codes, PowerShell, and those don't necessarily need to be compiled in order to run as a program. But you do want to have, or when you have stuff like Python, you can build very complex applications. that get compiled, and all of that code gets converted into machine code and can make it more difficult for somebody to reverse engineer if they don't have the right tools. Tony, I think I'm going to touch on the change management process actually either later, or it's honestly probably going to be I want to say it's 2.5 is when I get into change management. So it may not be tonight. But change management does tie a little bit into your DevOps and your DevSecOps. The DevOps is relying on automation for your efficiency. So being able to essentially automate a lot of your development process, any of the things that are time consuming that, somebody's got to go in and flip a switch, press a button in order to keep the process going. They've got to authorize something. You can create paths for it to be automated and move the package down the belt a little bit further all on its own. And then DevSecOps essentially is the same, but you're implementing security as part of the development process and being able to start from scratch with security as a mindset, as opposed to as it used to be 10 years ago, or even depending on the company today. You develop an application for your smart vacuum or your thermostat. Security is not your first thought there. You're really just trying to get something that's convenient for the user. And, it works great, but, it's vulnerable as can be, and it's web facing. You're creating vulnerabilities all over the world at that point. And so as you start to implement security as part of the development process, you start eliminating those issues off the bat, and it's not near as expensive to fix something security wise during the development as it is after something is created, and you have to go back in and you have to slap something on it at the end and hope it fixes it, or hope that it provides a security level that you want, and it's likely not going to be as secure as it possibly could be. Misty Eyed, great to have you here, and happy to be putting this on. And continuous validation is essentially testing your application and supporting that process of software development. So before something is deployed, you test it, you make sure everything is working and looks the way that it should be, and then it's pushed to production, and then you continue on back from step one. And then CI/CD is essentially the whole process of your DevOps or your DevSecOps. So it's continuous integration. So you're applying updates and improvements to the code base. Continuous delivery is an extension of that. It provisions rapid releases of changes into production. So you're essentially taking that continuous integration and you're automating it to pump it into production quicker than continuous integration, where it has other things it waits on. Misty Eyed, we are not doing 701 tonight, but we will be doing 701 probably in the new year. We're going to start breaking into that. But that being said, a lot of the material that we're going to cover is still applicable in 701, just maybe not in the exact same order. I'm working on some materials for that right now, and as we get into the new year, we're gonna rock and roll with 701. So continuous deployment is essentially, you have your delivery of patches, of improvements. It's all autopilot. So as you push them out, it gets pushed right on forward into production. But part of that is the continuous validation. You cannot have continuous deployment until you have continuous validation. Delivery waits on validation before it allows changes into production. So deployment is essentially setting up your automation to be able to look at your code, to be able to verify that it is secure before it allows it to enter into production. And then continuous monitoring is just using automation and scripting in order to look at security risks, compliance issues, and just being able to monitor for any issues in your code. So it's kind of part of that continuous validation, but it goes a little bit further into the production and operation of your code. All right, authentication, authorization, design. So the main parts here, got to know the differences between authentication and authorization. So authentication is verifying your identity, and authorization is that identity is allowed to access the material. So you can be authenticated as a user, but you may not be authorized to access the data you're requesting. So they are completely distinct items, but authentication is a big part of security, as it is essentially verifying who you are. And federating authentication is essentially being able to utilize one identity, or being able to set it up for your users to use one identity across multiple systems or multiple organizations. So when you go onto a website and you log in using Google, you're using a federated login. You're able to go to this website and say, hey, Google, tell them who I am, that I'm okay to access this. And without going in and creating an account in their database, Google says, okay, yeah, this is John. He's allowed to access this. This is his account, his Gmail account that we're utilizing, and he is who he says he is. And that's when you get into multi-factor authentication. Google will hit you on your phone and say, did you authorize this login? And then if so, you need to select the number that we're displaying on your screen at this time. So you got to select 22 and on your phone, and then your browser will update and it'll allow you access to the requested materials. And that part of it is essentially when Google is doing that on your behalf, that is the attestation. That is Google saying, we're providing that proof or evidence that you are who you say you are, and your credentials are good. We say you're allowed to access this. And multi-factor authentication is, as far as the terms that I've got at the bottom there, time-based one-time password, HMAC-based one-time password, you may or may not see those terms on the exam. Just knowing what a one-time password is, and then you're pretty much good to go from there. But having that distinction, most of the time when you're using Google Authenticator, stuff like that, you're using a time-based one-time password when it's ticking down on a clock. That's probably gonna be your most common one. And then, everybody's familiar with the SMS, your phone call, or push notification, multi-factor. Yeah, and so those are all something that you have. That is something that you don't know what that password is until you have that phone in your hand or you have that device in your hand. So multi-factor, it's got to be something you are, something you have, and then something you know are the three main requirements for multi-factor authentication. Depending on where you read, you may see there's 4, there's 5, there's 7 different ways. But when you break them all down to the base, it's really 3 that kind of can envelop all the different types. Your tokens, where you have the little device that has a number rolling on it, or you have a smart card that provides your authentication, or biometrics, which is very wide range, but the most common being fingerprints, iris, facial scan, or even voice scan. If you've done anything to do with ISC squared, you've probably done a vein scan. And I personally have never witnessed a gait analysis other than watching Mission Impossible, but I know it is out there, and it is something that can certainly be used as biometric authentication. So when you get into biometrics, you look at the efficacy rates. So you're looking at the false acceptance rate, the false rejection rate, and then where those two, the false acceptance and the false rejection, cross over is your crossover error rate. So that is the point at which the thresholds for each are the same. So depending on where you set your acceptance rate versus your rejection rate, that crossover error rate can move. So you can see this one's a little bit further left, but it's higher up. So you'll run into questions that'll ask you about the false acceptance rate and the false rejection rate, and the crossover error rate. And a lot of the time when they're asking these questions, they try to trick you on how or what the answer actually is. And most of it comes down to when you have whatever if it's the acceptance rate or the rejection rate, they'll phrase it in a way that it sounds like it should be, the answer should be crossover error rate, but it's, you've got to really read the question. And I'm pretty sure I've got a question here towards the end that we'll go over that covers this, but knowing the distinction between these three and read the question thoroughly, because they will use double negatives in order to make it sound like they're talking about rejection rate, but they're in fact talking about the acceptance rate. So CompTIA can be a little tricky on their phrasing of questions, but this is something just to review and take a look over when you get close to that exam date, just understanding the concepts behind it. But there's not a whole lot there. I mean, it's essentially false acceptance is you scan a fingerprint for your thumb to access your phone, and then you use your index finger and it allows you in. Well, that was a false acceptance because it allowed a fingerprint you hadn't scanned, allowed it in. And then your false rejection rate is, you scanned your thumbprint, it gave you the 100% when you scanned it in, and then you go to use it and it doesn't work. So why is it rejecting you? That's a false rejection because you're using the same finger in order to access, but you can't access it. So that crossover error rate is your sweet spot where you want to have a high enough acceptance rate, but a low enough rejection rate that you're not allowing people access to something that they shouldn't have access to, but you're also not impacting your users by preventing them from getting into what they need to get to, because there's a lot of false rejections for valid authentication. So like I said at the beginning, you have your authentication, which is verifying an identity. Your authorization is the process of permitting or denying access to a specific resource. So after you're authenticated, is this authenticated entity or identity allowed to access the resource they're requesting? And then your accounting, which is the number 3 on your AAA, and not the roadside assistance people, but authentication, authorization, and accounting, process of recording these events where somebody authenticated but they weren't authorized. You log it and you're able to track who did it, where that request came from, and just be able to have those records. So when it comes time for an audit, or you have any sort of question on this access to a particular resource, that you're able to come back to it and say, John accessed this resource from Eastern Europe at 1:30 in the morning. He doesn't normally log in at that time. We may have an issue here. But if you're not accounting for that, you're not actually logging that stuff, you won't find it. So accounting is a very key part to your authentication and identity process. And that is everything. No, that was all. Cool. So that was all of the material I have for tonight, but I do have some quiz questions we can go over pertaining to this material in particular, and we can rock and roll. So get your phones ready, and we're going to go to vevox.app, so vevox.app, and we'll do some practice questions. And let's go ahead and it's been too long forgetting how to actually launch all this stuff. There we go, start session. Don't eat my keyboard. See what you're doing there. All right. Cool. All right, guys. Why are you being a little terror? You want to say hi to everybody? Yeah. You've not been very much of a helper tonight. You've been a hindrance. You've been wiggling in my lap all night. All right, so go ahead and hop on vvox.app. ID number is 164-722-069. And we'll go ahead and jump into some practice questions. And then I will hang out a little bit after this as well to answer any questions you may have. Doesn't really matter cybersecurity or not. We can chat and go from there. All right, so problems. In what phase will specifically stop continuous deployment, but not necessarily continuous delivery? So problems in what phase will specifically stop continuous deployment, but not necessarily continuous delivery? Looking like we got 10 of y'all beautiful people in here tonight. Thank y'all for coming out. If you want to join in, jump on vvox.app in your web browser. Let's slay some of these questions. I'm going to give it another couple seconds. Looks like we got 2 people in the room participating right now. Three people, so we'll wait on a... All right, so we got 2 of 3 answered now. Go ahead and close this question. All right, so we're 50-50 split on continuous integration and continuous development. The answer here is actually validation. So when you have continuous deployment, it is automated. So if you have an issue in the validation process, if there's an issue in the code, it will stop the deployment of code into production under continuous deployment. Continuous delivery essentially sets it up to be deployed, but it doesn't actually deploy it into production. So you normally won't have validation limiting it because you're going to have a stop before you actually have that deployment after delivery. So continuous validation, that automation will stop the deployment of software in a continuous deployment environment. So when a program is installed and needs permissions, what is this called? What is the process called for giving permissions to a program? Could be to a user, could be for a piece of hardware. Is it staging, provisioning, continuous integration, or version control? Looks like we got 3 of 4 answered. Oh, we are split across the board here again. So provisioning. Provisioning is your assignment of rights or permissions to an object, user, or an application. So when you provision something, you are giving it access to your network, to the data and things it needs to use in order to be productive. All right, so to protect software from reverse engineering by attackers, developers can use which of the following? When they're trying to prevent attackers from being able to reverse engineer their code. Is it dead code? Is it code that you're not using anymore? Doesn't reference anything, and the application runs and just skips right over it? Or it's commented out? Is it obfuscation, trying to hide the code, make it difficult to read? We didn't cover it, but binary diversity, essentially having different binaries for different operating systems, and the way that they run, they operate a little bit differently. Or is it stored procedures? Which we may or may not have made up answers here. All right, we've got 4 of 4. All right, so obfuscation's got 1. We've got 3 on stored procedures. Obfuscation was the correct answer here. So being able to hide the properties, being able to prevent examination of the code, and just making it difficult to decompile that code and make it difficult for attackers to be able to reverse engineer what you've got going on, being able to see how the processes work together. If you can make that difficult, it can be enough of a hurdle that it'll make them leave your code alone. If you've ever pulled down a binary from one of the app stores and you've tried to decompile it, how many times you get hit with all these sorts of obfuscation or write blocks or sandbox blocking and stuff like that, can make it very difficult to reverse engineer code. So you can make that code less easy to read. It just adds to that complexity and makes it harder, and just dissuades the attackers from being able to, or to want to actually break into it. So which of the following environments is used to test compatibility against multiple target environments? So I talked about this earlier. In my current job, I've got, test environments. I've got staging environments. We have QA environments as well. But when we've got multiple environments and we've got to deploy across a large scope, as a Fortune 50 company, what do we use? Which one of the environments are we using when we are doing a slow deploy across the globe? And we're trying not to break the entire network all in one shot. Tony, I just saw your message about the VBox not working. If you're having trouble with it, sometimes you gotta close the tab out, restart the browser. It does sometimes hang up, or if you let the screen go blank on your phone, if you're using your phone, it'll hang up and you got to restart the app completely or restart the browser. All right, so we got Tony's answer in the chat saying staging. Let's see what everybody else said. We're split across the board again. So while test and quality assurance aren't necessarily incorrect answers, we're looking for the best answer. So the staging environment is where you deploy releases against different targets. So I've got servers in Asia, I've got servers in the US, I've got servers in Europe. I'm using a staging environment to deploy those updates slowly across all of the environments so I don't break everything all at once. When you have a test environment, you normally deploy straight into production. and you've normally got one target, maybe two targets that you're deploying to, but they're normally working together. So you can't just update one. You've normally got both of them where you're updating at the same time. So the test environment, while you would use it to test compatibility, you're normally testing against one instance, whereas a staging environment, you are essentially utilizing that environment to simulate multiple environments and use it as a platform to launch those updates into the production environments that may have different configurations, slightly different settings across your organization. So they could have just slightly different patch levels, and you just don't want to break something on the. So Edgar, staging is to deploy. You use it to deploy. It's just an evolution of the test environment to be able to hold your update while. So if you look at it like if you've got you've got development, you've got test, you've got staging, and then deployment. Your staging environment allows you to move something out of your testing environment, put it into staging to prep it for deployment across your entire organization. And it frees up your test environment for the next update that's coming after that one. So it gives you an extra step to continue updating or to continue working on your project while not waiting for all of it to deploy all at once. So if you're sitting there and you've got, say, 4 weeks to deploy across your entire network, if you have that sitting in your test environment, you have something that is sitting in your development environment that cannot move until your test environment's freed up. So you've got 4 weeks that you can't do anything with it. If you've got it in staging, you've moved it out of the test environment, you can be working on your update, move it out of development, go into the test environment, and do your testing while you're still deploying those previous updates out of the staging environment. So it is, staging and test are very similar, but just kind of slightly different use cases. Normally for your larger organization, staging is going to be your main utilization, or just for large applications that affect a large scope of the business. All right, so you spent the last week tweaking a fingerprint scanning solution for your organization. Despite your best efforts, 1 in 50 attempts will fail, even if the user is using the correct finger and their fingerprint is in the system. Wow, I put a period instead of a comma and it made me read that all sorts of funny. Your supervisor says 1 in 50 is good enough and tells you to move on to the next project. Your supervisor just defined which of the following for your fingerprint scanning system. So 1 in 50 attempts will fail. And your supervisor says 1 in 50 is good enough. So 1 in 50 failing. So you've got the right fingerprint, you got the correct fingerprints in the system, but that one is still failing. Is it a false rejection rate, false acceptance rate, a critical threshold, or failure acceptance criteria? 1 in 50 is failing. Give y'all a couple more seconds here. Are you being a little brat? Huh? All right, we are at 5:05. Go ahead and close the poll. It looks like we're split across 3 here. We've got 2 people answered false acceptance rate, 2 failure acceptance criteria, and 1 for false rejection rate. So the answer we were looking for is false rejection rate. So falsely rejecting 1 in 50 is your supervisor essentially designated that your false rejection rate is 1 in 50. That's good enough. So he said, move on and we'll take that. That's an acceptable rate of rejection. That it's not terrible. But if it was, 1 in 50 of fingerprints that weren't in the system were accepted, then it would be your false acceptance rate. So this is the kind of question that you will see on the exam, whether it's a 601 or 701, where you have 1 in 50 attempts will fail, and then you have negative words like fail, and then you have positive words like correct, to kind of throw you off and make you kind of twist your thinking a little bit. And so you really want to look at it as, okay, so 1 in 50 fails. So 1 in 50 was rejected. And then you see, so they were using the correct finger and correct fingerprint. So they were the correct ones. They were, those other 49 were appropriately accepted, but one was falsely rejected. So that would give you your false rejection rate when your supervisor says, 1 in 50 being rejected is okay. So this is a kind of example of one of the tricky questions that you will see on the exam, where they will try and get you switched up between the false acceptance, which would be a fingerprint you don't have in the system gets accepted, versus a fingerprint you have in the system doesn't get accepted. And then failure acceptance criteria, I'm pretty sure I made that one up for this one. So next question, which of the following algorithms uses a secret key with a current timestamp to generate a one-time password? So which of the following algorithms uses a secret key? So we got to think about what we know about secret keys and a current timestamp. So start looking at the keywords in the question. So secret key with a current timestamp, your one-time passwords, your authentications, they're for the most part going to have secret keys, but I'm leaning towards that timestamp being the key word in this question. And so, hash-based Mac would normally it'll use a secret key, but it'll also use a hashing algorithm, which they've got the word algorithm in there, but, I'm not quite leaning towards that because I've got a time-based question, then I've got a date hash message authentication protocol, which I personally, I don't know if I've heard of that, at least from my Security Plus studies. So when I'm looking at these answers, I'm looking at this question, I'm leaning towards, familiar terms. I've seen HMAC, I've seen TOTP, I've got single sign-on it doesn't use an algorithm with a secret key and a timestamp necessarily. So, at least for the sign-on part, maybe for the authentication, but not for the federated sign-ons. So I've got it down to 2 answers based off of, the familiar terms that I've got, the hash-based message authentication code or the time-based one-time password. So we'll go ahead and see what the answer is here. So TOTP, time-based one-time word. That is what we're looking for. So you have a secret key that you were given. So whether it was that QR code you scanned, and then it uses the time off of your phone. So if you have, say you powered off your phone and it doesn't do a time update, or the time is off by a few minutes, your Google Authenticator may not work. It'll be off by a significant amount, because if it's using a time-based one-time password, you may be a couple minutes out of sync with what they're looking for server side. So that would be our answer there, because we're looking for a current timestamp to create that time-based one-time password. So next question, with regard to authentication, an access token falls into which factor category? So which of multi-factor authentication, which of the categories does it fall into? Access token is in which factor category? Is it something you are, something you have, something you know, or somewhere you are? So we've got an access token. So an access token sounds like, something that I would put into an arcade machine. It'd be something that I would hold in my hand. So is it somewhere you are? Is it something you have? Is it something you know? Or is it something you are? Give it a couple more seconds. Got 4 of 5 answered. And we'll go ahead and close the poll. So something you have, y'all got it. And a access token is something you are going to have on a keychain. You're going to have it in your pocket, and you're going to use that to provide authentication. If you are logging in, you know your password, but your multi-factor is going to be this little device you have in your pocket or you have on your phone, your access token. That's going to grant you that one-time password, whether it's time-based or it's HMAC, an HOTP, HMAC one-time password. You're going to have an access token that's going to give you that authentication. And final question for tonight. When you are designing and tweaking biometric systems, the point where both the accept and reject error rates are equal is known as which of the following? Is it a crossover acceptance rate? Is it an accept reject overlap rate? Is it a crossover error rate? An overlap acceptance rate? So when I get a question like this, I look at the terms they give me and, I try and convert them into acronyms. Sometimes it's easier to remember 3 letters than it is to remember 3 words. So if I know I've got an FAR, an FRR, and then the third term, which of the acronyms am I familiar with out of those 4 answers? So I know there was one that was a C something, so I can eliminate a couple of these answers. I know we had FAR, FRR, and C something R. Well, I've got a crossover acceptance rate. I've got a crossover error rate, so I've got a 50-50 shot of getting this one right if I know that there was something to do with biometrics and a C something R acronym. So we've got 4 of 5 answers. Go ahead and close this one out. We are rolling up on 8 o'clock here. So crossover error rate, that is the correct answer. So the error rate, so when you think about the false acceptance rate and the false rejection rate, those are errors. So a crossover acceptance rate is made up. That is not something that, at least from what Security Plus teaches you, is something that you need to know or has a meaning. But the crossover error rate is that junction point between your accept and reject error rates. And that is essentially the most efficient operation of a biometric system, but it may be a point where it might not be the most ideal for your system. So it does depend a lot on how your configuration is and what your user's tolerance is to rejections. So you may have a higher false rejection rate because you want your security to be a little bit higher, and your false acceptance rate may be very low. So the most efficient point is where those two are at the lowest point possible in reference to each other, but that may not always be the best for your situation, which gets into a whole lot of deep knowledge into biometrics that you don't necessarily need to know for the Security Plus exam. But just knowing those terms and how that graph looks with the X and that crossover error rate being in the center of those two parabolic arcs making the X. But that is everything for tonight. I appreciate y'all coming out, and I apologize for last week with my hot garbage internet connection not allowing me to stream. And I got 12 of y'all here tonight. Thank you so much. And any questions, any comments, please feel free to drop them in chat. Love to get some feedback on how everything looked and how you thought about the delivery this evening, and any questions you may have regarding Security Plus, cybersecurity, or just how life is. We can chat for a few minutes. I'll probably go to 8-10ish if y'all have anything. If not, we'll wrap up for the evening. Dang it, I lost the music too. The wrong button. All right, so any questions, any comments? How's everybody's Christmas holiday preparations going? We had kind of a pre-Christmas get together over the weekend. Had some good food, some good Italian food, and I made some focaccia that was absolutely incredible. Tony, ISSA, I can't speak for the entire organization. From what I've seen, personally, I'm a part of the Metro Atlanta chapter for ISSA. It is an incredible organization. They are very inclusive. They're typically, when they have any sort of events that are going on or anything like that, where there's a possibility for continuing education credits or units, they normally don't cost anything, whether it's webinars or you go for the evening to one of the local events. Our chapter will actually hold a meeting the last Thursday of every month, and they provide dinner, and then there's an hour talk from a sponsoring company or somebody in the community that wants to present something. A lot of the times they work for a company, but they're normally subject matter experts in the field, whether it's in audit or they're in network security, whatever may be the case. But they normally have very, very good presentations. I've been to a couple of them, one based on AI, one based on CMMC, and you get a meal out of it. You get your continuing education credits, and you get to meet some really great people along the way. So I absolutely recommend ISSA. The ISSA chapter up here is absolutely incredible. I did the entire CISP training through them. They actually held their own training course for it. Didn't cost me anything because I was a member of the local chapter. But I think compared to some of the other groups in the area, I've gotten the most value out of ISSA. So absolutely, I would be all about joining them and participating as much as possible. Yeah, Tony, the webinars are great too. And they're not just your local chapter. You'll see a lot of them are Denver is very active. You'll see DC pop up. You'll see Boston. There's a ton of chapters around the world, and the topics are wide ranging. So I absolutely recommend checking out their stuff. And they often set up time for networking and things like that, so you can meet some of the other people in the webinar, connect with them on LinkedIn, make a few new friends. So absolutely recommend it. Can't say enough good things about them. So Tony, what webinar is it that you're attending tomorrow? Trying to look here. I know I got an invite from them. They're trying to eat my stuff. Crazy girl. Yeah, it's buried in my email. I know I got an invite from them to attend a webinar tomorrow. I only get to attend about 25% of them that they send to me, but pretty much all of them have been fantastic. And there is a lot of talk on AI, the mentoring opportunities. Depending on the chapter. So I'm working with our local Atlanta chapter right now to hopefully get their AIM program, which is their apprenticeship, internship, and mentorship program off the ground, where we can involve local companies and local leaders within the industry and start providing opportunities to students and people trying to do career change like I did, and be able to get into the industry and be successful and be equipped with all the tools that they need. So yep, the building a responsible AI culture, that was the one I got. So I'll hopefully see you in chat there for the webinar. But yeah, the AIM program, I saw Denver has a successful iteration of it, and I'm trying to work with our local chapter to see if we can get it off the ground here in Atlanta, but just trying to get some more information from the organization in order to get it moving forward and get the program off the ground. I really enjoy doing these streams and being a part of the community, and if I can make a local impact and help the Atlanta cybersecurity community grow through fostering that mentorship and internship opportunities for young professionals and career changing professionals. And it's something that I want to give to the community and see what I can do. So we'll see what happens. But it is 8:10. I've got a puppy wiggling in my lap that probably needs to go outside, and I'm going to call it at this point. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the Slay Security Plus Discord, or hit me up on LinkedIn at the final part of the URL is Taylor McDonald 1. So Taylor-McDonald 1. But yeah, anything I can do, anything I can help with, I'm happy to. Anybody who wants one-on-one, just help you through a particular topic, I'm happy to go through it with you. Helps me learn as much as it helps you, and I enjoy doing it. So thank y'all for being here. Thank y'all for listening to me for a little over an hour, and I look forward to doing it some point next week. I know we've got Christmas next Monday, so I will be spending time with the family, but hopefully find another opportunity during the week to pop up on stream, and we can do some more. So thank y'all again. Have a wonderful evening and make it a great week.